A very good afternoon to all of you. Um, you have already been introduced to Keki Daruwala. So I will not say much about his biography right now. But as you all know, Keki Daruwala has been a major poet in English for over 4 decades now. And he also actually has turned to fiction. And he's also a major writer now of fiction. He has 11 books of poetry to his name since 1970. And he has 3 novels and 5 short story collections. That's a lot of work over 4 decades. Now, you know that his first collection of poetry was Under Orion, published in 1970. And this is what Nissim Ezekiel wrote of Under Orion. It was received with great critical acclaim, his entry into the Indian English poetry scene. This is what Nissim Ezekiel wrote of Under Orion. He wrote of it as impressive evidence not only of mature poetic talent, but of literary stamina, intellectual strength, and social awareness. Keki, of course, has been writing poetry now for 4 decades. And he belongs, interestingly, to that very, well, it's not that rare, but still unusual group of writers who excel in both poetry and fiction. Some examples from the world would be writers such as Borges, Samuel Beckett, Margaret Atwood, Roberto Bolaño, Ben Okri. And from here in Kerala, we have Kamala Das, right, who wrote as Madhavikutty in Malayalam. But she also wrote fiction in English. She published some short stories in English as well, and of course poetry. And we also have the example of a forgotten writer, Maithil Radhakrishnan, of both, who excelled in both poetry and fiction. And from English in India, we of course have Jeet Thayil, now writing apparently only poetry. And we have Meena Kandasamy among young writers. And we've already had Vikram Seth. You know, it's a long tradition. There's Rabindranath Tagore, there is Agge, there is Sunil Gangabadhyay, there is Chandrasekhara Kambar in Kannada. So it is a long and hallowed tradition actually of still unusual for someone to work in both genres. And Keki Daruwala belongs to that tradition of writers who write both poetry and fiction, especially the novel. It's not short stories. The novel is a completely different animal, actually. So since our conversation is to be on poetry and fiction, I will try to connect Keki Daruwala, the poet, with Keki Daruwala, the novelist. I'll start with the first question. When we read I have been reading your poetry since I was 18. And what I noticed even then, you know, one of the first poems I really liked was The Snowman, which is actually a narrative poem on a fictional character. So what is noticeable from your poetry right from the start is that it has features of fiction in it. You do voices, you do narration, and you do characters, right? So how important, you know, has that poetic voice, the poetic narrative voice or poetic characterization, how important has that been to your fiction?
Thank you, Sabitha. I started with poetry and a few years later with short stories. So actually they gelled, and I couldn't write a novel because I was on a job which required 10 to 12 hours a day. So you can't write novels when you are stuck for time. The other thing is the very name Under Orion. Orion is a constellation which drifts across the whole sky in one day. So Orion is a drifter, and that is why well, the travel also comes along, but in the first book there is no travel. And later, even in a sonnet on Sappho, I have Orion. Do you want me to read it?
Yes, please. This is from Keki Daruwala's Sappho poems.
Sorry. Yes. Sappho came from Lesbos, and her voice has a particular stanza. 8 syllables for the first 3 lines, and the 4th line short. I thought of her as an old Sappho. She used to write to Aphrodite, and I'll read the poem. Long and lonely are my nights. All her sonnets or her writing was addressed to the goddess of love, Venus, or Aphrodite as she's called. Long and lonely are my nights. Come help me, goddess, and my plight. Her absence burns me, burns my sides with love intense. Aphrodite, hail or sleet, I implore you to come down from Crete. My altar smokes, awaits your feet with frankincense. Your love demented Sappho pleads, give me no manna and no mead. It's love, not wine, that Sappho needs. You understand, I haven't had a word from her. Once again, make her my lover in bed, and however her breast should flower in my hands.
Beautiful. This also connects me to, how he has a lot of another thematic connection, if we can talk of it that way, between Keki Daruwala's poetry and fiction has been travel, journeying, right? Journeying has been a constant theme in his poetry. Journey has been important to his work as a writer. So he has a series of poems, for example, on Helsinki, the new series of poems on Delphi. And of course there is Cairo, which appears in both For Pepper and Christ and in his poetry. So Egypt, Greece, a lot of Europe, and also actually travels within India, like Ranikhet. So Keki Daruwala also has a collection of short stories called A House in Ranikhet, and there are a series of poems on Ranikhet as well. So travel actually has been a major theme in both his poetry and fiction. And journeying itself, the act of journeying itself, embarkation, even what you call de-bussing, and in your new novel, you use the word de-bussing, getting off the bus. So embarkation, getting on the bus, getting off the bus, getting off the boat, landing, all of these are recurrent motifs in your poetry.
What change is the mantra of life. And if you go back to Buddha, at the moment I'm reading a lot of Buddha, he emphasizes change and points out to change also as suffering. We suffer because we move from life to death, from parting with friends. So change and travel are a part of each other, and I look at them for inspiration also. Travel gives you inspiration. I was called to Cyprus in December for a conference, and then they said, please write poems on Cyprus. I came back, and in 2 days I got 4 poems on Cyprus. So there it is. The incentive, the stimulus comes often to many writers through travel.
Can I ask you to read one poem? This is from his second last collection of poetry, Fire Altar. It's absolutely beautiful. I recommend it to everybody who loves poetry. This is a poem called The Second Boat.
Which one?
Second Boat.
That's a very long one. Oh, the second boat.
The second boat, yeah.
I hope I don't give you the impression that I am writing on Greeks and Persians and Egyptians. My first two collections in poetry had only the North Indian landscape, and they were based in the villages of North India. Sorry, I should also speak to the leftists. Why should I speak only to the rightists? So the accent started changing when I traveled abroad. And I started traveling abroad after 1980. But the boats were sent to Delphi to find out whether Croesus would win a battle against Cyrus. And there are 10 poems, short poems, but this one is the second boat. Since there is no account of the second boat, we take it that it never took off. The past has its laws. That which is not chronicled never happened. And it is going into myth. It is also going into the strength of the written word. You know, the written word is written in stone.
That brings me to the question on mythology in your poetry and actually also in your fiction, really. Mythology has been, again, a very, very important, if we can say, foundation of Keiki Daruwala's work. He has explored, actually, a lot of mythologies and histories very, very deeply. So, you know, for example, not just the Delphi poems, but also Agni Sutta. Poems such as Agni Sutta or Maya explore Buddhist philosophy. And then we have his poems on the Kauravas. So there is also Indian mythology being explored. It is not all Western and Egyptian. It is also a lot of Indian roots of thought, really, which is actually what makes him also an intellectual poet. You know, he's not just a poet of landscape, as he's often called, or you know, a poet of narration or description, but very much actually an intellectual poet, rooted in the intellectual traditions of the East. And for this again, journey is an important thing. So, you know, when we talk about mythology, you create your own mythologies, right? And you have characters like map makers, Asturlabis in your poetry and fiction.
Shall I say something? You know, firstly, when you start poetry, you are also looking for ballast. You are looking for material. When I looked at myth, whatever I appropriated from myth, I would appropriate. But I could see that most of the myths were lies. We know it. Mythology is good fictional, better novelists than us, better, that is how even epics are described. I just read an article, not just, a year back, where the man said that there is no Troy, there's nothing like Troy or the Trojan War, but Homer made it the Helen who launched 1,000 ships. So there it is. You take out something from myth and I am a demythifier. So I would take a myth and try to slash it very often. There was, for example, Lokayata, Charvak. it hit me. I mean, nothing of Mahabharat hit me, only Charvak, and I wrote a poem on Charvak. Sorry, what did you want me to read?
No, would you like to read the poem on Charvak, actually?
Huh?
Would you like to read the poem on Charvak?
No, that's I don't know. It's a very old poem, and I would rather leave it out, but I leave it to you.
No, but I'm asking you to then read also an older poem, Old Map Maker.
Okay.
Actually, that's himself. He is the map maker, not quite old, but map maker.
The history of the poem, the history of the poem is I wrote a first sonnet, and my editor, very, very accomplished, Ravi Dayal, he was a giant in publishing, and he said this is a bad poem, though it had already been published in a US magazine, American magazine. And that touched me to the quick, and I wrote 3 more sonnets following the map maker, and the book was also called The Map Maker. I'll read 2 sonnets from The Map Maker. Sorry. No, not this. I don't want to read this. Can I? 1 second, I'm sorry to waste your time.
Old map maker?
No, the old map maker is too long.
You have time.
The other map maker, the 4 sonnets. Anyway,
The mic.
You know the people from sorry. Where is the other map maker poem? The one where I talked about the... Sorry. Yes. Map maker. There are 4 sonnets, and the last one talks about the great cyclone in Odisha. 2nd sonnet. Does the world need maps where sign and symbol stand as proxies, get worked into scrolls? You see them, mountain chains with rain gods in their armpits and glaciers locked like glass slivers in their folds. Desert, scrub, pasture, do they need shading? They are all there for the eye to apprehend. A family of cactus and camel thorn tells you where one begins and the other ends. These questions confound me. I'd rather paint for a while a ship on the skyline or cloud shadow moving like a spreading stain. And there is a small one where I advise myself that you should map love, hate, and emotions. Forget markings, forget landfall and sea. Go easy, man, I tell myself, breathe. Gulls will mark the estuary for you. Bubbles will indicate where the swamps seethe. Map the wrinkles on the aging skin of love. Forget eastings, northings. They stand for order. Cry if you must over that locust line, flayed open into a barbarized border. I was talking about the Indo-Pakistan border fence. And the last sonnet I'll read. If you map the future while a millennium... Am I too loud? Am I too loud? It's all right. Okay. If you map the future while a millennium moves on its hinges, you may find the present turned into an anachronism. This too is important. What is yours and mine, the silk of these shared moments. But having stuck to love and poetry, heeding the voice of reason and experiencing the different textures of a season of love and love's eternal season, I put a clamp on yearning, shun latitudes, renounce form, and turn my eye to the far kingdom of bloodless Kalinga, battling with a storm. Dampen your fires, turn from lighthouse, spire, steeple. Forget maps and voyaging, study instead the parched earth horoscope of a brown people. Thank you.
While map making and journeying has been a constant theme, I would like to connect this to finally something biographical about you exploring your Persian roots. How much of the Parsi self is there in Keki Daruwala's poetry. There is actually quite a lot, and increasingly more. Also in fiction, and he has a book called Ancestral Affairs, which is kind of memoir, fictionalized memoir sort of work. And he explores his Persian roots very much actually in this collection, Fire Altar. And the Parsi root actually has also meant that, for me at least when I read your poetry, migration, right? I mean, you're always between places. That has been your life as well. He moved actually from, his father moved from Western Punjab to Eastern Punjab. Keki himself studied in Junagadh, in various places actually, including Eastern Punjab. Then he lived in Ranikhet for a while. He lived in Delhi, of course, for several years. And, there is, and he has constantly been traveling. So there is this idea of, I wouldn't like to say exile because that's cliched now, the diaspora and exile and that kind of stuff. But there is very much the theme of being between places, right? Would you like to say something about how you explore, go back to that in some sense? Remember those boats that never landed?
You see, the poems on Parsis or Persians started at the fag end of my poetry career, if I may say so. Incidentally, the poetic clock is beating rather fast. So I wrote sort of a requiem on the entire civilization which we had left behind and come to India once. Mostly sonnets, also, what shall I say, longer poems. But it has a unity. It is only on the Persian civilization which we left behind, and Zoroastrian, because we are Zoroastrians, we are followers of Zarathustra.
This is my last question on his poetry, and then we move to a reading from his new novel. I wanted to just ask you a quick question about poetry or the writer's role now in today's India, poetry and political commitment. Because you have returned, he of course returned his Sahitya Academy Award during the whole award Vapsi thing. And he has been writing, a lot, in fact, about the current regime and the culture of intolerance and hatred in India right now. So he's also very politically, socially active, an active writer. He's also been actually writing doggerels which are kind of satirical poems. But I would ask him to read one last poem, and then we will read. Then we will read from your new novel.
No, I think, excuse my saying it, I think I'd come to fiction. But you talked about returning the award. Returning the award, I went out of the country to my daughter. And when I came back, I found Professor Kalburgi has been killed. And after that, in Haryana and in the states around Delhi, we found a lot of intolerance. The cow vigilantism had not started, but then Muhammad Akhlaq was killed, and a few things suddenly happened. And it was a wave started by Ashok Vajpayee, Nayantara Sehgal, and I think 2 days later I returned the award because the Academy had not done enough for the recipients. They should have at least objected. And the family of Professor Kalburgi said that till 40 days we have not had a phone call even from the Sahitya Academy. That decided me, and we left the award. And I feel that where the policy is totally geared towards one section of the people, and secular had become a bad word. They were calling it secular. I thought we had to protest against it, and I wrote for the next 2 years article after article in the Tribune and in the Express against this sort of bias.
We will move on to your fiction, but since you don't want to read this, I will read 2 lines from his. His politics actually did not start later. He wrote a poem on Gujarat. This is Gujarat 2002. Would you read it?
Please.
Would you read it? Yeah.
Me to read it, I'll read.
Yes, yeah.
Not the whole thing, it's a long poem.
No, it's a very short poem.
Okay. Gujarat 2002, sorry, not 200. There's blood on the streets, so many dying and the dead, that dark-grained newspapers squint with red. Fire and skin turn into one blinding sheet, and in any weather, life and charred skin will peel together. Boards are warped, the steel blackened inside. There's a mother in travail, there could be a bride. Killer and killed are one, they speak the same language. The vocabulary of guilt has a circumference and a center. Gasoline alights with a splash everywhere. Knives hiss with the same silence where they enter. Gujarat is not just the corruption of an absolute. It has manufactured its own corrupt absolutes. If night falls on Godra, we are within our rights to unload night on innocence elsewhere. There is no place here for lyre and the lute. In such times is lockjaw the best. To be dumb, to be mute, I end it with a question, the poem. I haven't read from the novel at all.
Yes, so we are just coming to that. His new novel, Swerving to Solitude, Letters to Mama, is set in the emergency period. And it would be great if he could read from his fiction. He's reinventing himself more as a novelist now, even though I cast him in the role of the poet more.
Can I just read a passage from the emergency? heroine, if I may use the term. I don't like to use the term heroine, but the central character who is writing, she is also innocent, and she is married to a deputy secretary who is in the PMO, the Prime Minister's office, and she doesn't know the emergency has been promulgated because she didn't open the radio. So she phones up her husband, Nishant, and says, what is wrong? I mean, the preparation of onion raita is on the front page of one of the national newspapers. And what can you do about it? And then he silences her and dartos her as we talk about it. And then he comes home at 9, and then he tells the wife. The wife is Siba. What was he doing at, our blunder that morning was that we hadn't listened to the news. When Nishant returned around 9 in the evening, I heard the full story. It seems at midnight, while the president was in the bathtub. What was he doing at midnight in the bathtub, for Christ's sake? Having a bloody bath, Seema. What else? Well, there was a knock on the washroom door. Who is it? Asked the president. Oh, Mehta, Minister of State for Home, sir. What do you want? Sir, you may kindly sign this ordinance. Let me first dry myself, said the president. I mean, let me first soap myself, then wash the soap off, and then dry myself. You have got me confused. It's in a lighter vein. I hope you realize that. After 7 minutes, the door squeaked open. The papers were passed on to him, and he signed. When later he was put up before one of the 50 commissions, that's the Minister of State, not the President, obviously. When later he was put up before one of the 50 commissions set up by the Janta government and asked whether he had seen the signing authority, the minister denied seeing him sign. The signatures were affixed in sanitized privacy, Your Honor, said the defense lawyer, who held an ME, Master of Euphemism degree from St. Stephen's College. So how would you know the document bore the president's signature? Did you send the document to a handwriting expert before implementing what was in the ordinance? Mr. Minister, I mean Mr. Ex-Minister, asked the learned judge, chairman of the commission. Minister had no answer. Why didn't the predecessor step out of the bathroom and sign? Your Honor, said the defense lawyer representing the minister, the president had a towel wrapped around him. Judge, has the towel been produced in evidence as an exhibit? The Attorney General sprang to the defense of the prosecution, worried that the commission was looking for a loophole to acquit the ex-Minister of State for Home Affairs, MHA. Your Honor, it was too wet to be packaged and sealed. That mollified the judge a bit, and he wrote in the judgment that the signing in the washroom did not make the ordinance actus reus. These are legal terms, you know, he was very fond of. Actus reus, meaning a guilty act, because the president was compos mentis, meaning in full command of his faculties. The judge was fond of Latin quotes, and defense lawyers were usually ready with their own arsenal from Latin limbos. So I'm not against both the emergency and what is going on today.
We don't have any more time. I'd like to mention one last thing and say thank you. His first novel, For Pepper and Christ, is partly set here in Calicut, right? It's about the landing of Vasco da Gama. It's also Vasco da Gama recruiting astronomers from Cairo, etc., and then coming to Kapad. So those who are interested, I think his books are probably available here. So I just wanted to mention that, you know, For Pepper and Christ, set in partly in Calicut, we haven't spoken about at all, and there is no time. So I'd just like to thank all of you and urge you to read Keki Daruwala if you haven't.
This one is on Calicut. This is Vasco da Gama coming to Calicut and the whole history behind it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your great readings, and thank you all for being a great audience. Thank you. Do we have time for questions? No, but we have questions. Questions. We have questions now.
Good afternoon, sir. Sir, I am Little Oganath. I am a native of Kozhikode, and I am an emerging poet. I should say this is my first collection of 125 poems. So I can rather write about more about my students, my personal life, my father, my mother, more about celebrations than mourning. So what do you think about a writer doing this mourning about the past events of our tragedies happening in India or worldwide, than being a celebratory one? Because I'm thinking that people are more of focusing about pleasure. So that when I'm going with my book to a shop, they are not at all interested, because they are saying that poetry is having no interest when compared to novels, because they are more of fantasy and poetry comes for the truth. So people are reluctant to receive books, and I'm suffering the same.
Excuse me, but can you make your question short so that others can
Yeah,
answer?
I'm asking whether, no, I think a poet is having that patience to listen. Yes. What do you think about a writer who is more celebrative, more writing about the happiness, writing about love rather than these tragedies? Or because I think these tragedies are having no remedies at all. Or how can a writer be more remedious?
May I answer? I mean, firstly, you write what hits you in the gut and in the heart. So you have to take that up first. Secondly, you have an advantage. What a woman writes, what a lady writes, that becomes political. How you live, the relations with the husband, relations with the mother, and the relations with the mother-in-law and father-in-law, all that immediately becomes political and relevant, because it's the more, I mean, we heard Ramchandra Guha yesterday, and that is the most relevant thing that is happening. So I think you start with an advantage over many other male writers. I'm sorry, it's not a gender statement, but you have nothing to worry about. And you write what you want to write, not what the publisher expects and what society expects. Yes, yes, that lady there. She wants to.
Where is the mic?
My question is about, you said that you create your own myths, and it is not the acceptable myths. Usually, if we are using the acceptable myths, it's quite easy to convey the idea, is it? Then, when you are creating your myths, is it do you find any difficulty in conveying your ideas to the readers? That it's not a popular one, it's not acceptable one, but you are creating your own. Do you find any difficulty in conveying that or in creating the new myths?
Difficulty in
Creating
New myths.
myths.
Huh.
Well, myth has a past. Myth has not a future. Of course, political myths can be manufactured any second day. I mean, Ghar Vapsi and so many other things. But otherwise, myth is a part of the dekchi of the past, of the cavern of the past, the cave of the past. So I don't think you can twist the old myth. I wouldn't presume or arrogate to myself that I can create a new myth.
Thank you so much. That was Keki and Daruwala in conversation with Sabitha Satchi.
There's one more question, I think. And
So
we have 3 more minutes.
now it's time for extending our gratitude, and Didi Damodaran on behalf of KLF will present a token of love.
വേദിയിൽ അടുത്തതായി നിണബലി PF മാത്യൂസിന്റെ കഥ